The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of the British Embassy in Prague as Staff Sergeant Marcus Wellington adjusted his ceremonial uniform for the third time. The red tunic, adorned with gleaming brass buttons and intricate gold braiding, represented centuries of tradition and honor. As a member of the Queen's Guard, Marcus had served at Buckingham Palace, Windsor Castle, and now found himself on special diplomatic assignment in the Czech Republic. The embassy building itself was a testament to British architectural elegance, its Georgian facade standing proudly among the Baroque buildings of the historic Malá district. Inside, diplomats and staff moved with purposeful efficiency, preparing for what was expected to be a routine day of international relations. The British ambassador, Sir Harold Pemberton, had specifically requested the presence of a Queen's Guard for an upcoming ceremony honoring a new trade agreement between Britain and several Eastern European nations. Marcus had arrived in Prague 3 days earlier, his reputation preceding him. At 32, he was considered one of the finest soldiers in the regiment, with 12 years of impeccable service. His colleagues often remarked on his unwavering dedication to protocol and his deep respect for the traditions he represented. The bearskin hat, the pristine white gloves, the polished boots that reflected the morning light. Every element of his uniform was maintained to perfection. The embassy's chief of staff, Elizabeth Morrison, had briefed Marcus thoroughly on the day's proceedings. Various foreign dignitaries would arrive throughout the morning, including representatives from Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, and Romania. Among them would be Colonel Viktor Kozlov, a high-ranking military attaché from a neighboring country known for its complicated relationship with Western diplomatic customs. As Marcus took his position at the embassy's main entrance, he noticed the unusual activity in the surrounding streets. Local police had cordoned off several blocks, and curious onlookers gathered behind barriers, their cameras ready to capture glimpses of the arriving dignitaries. Prague's media had taken considerable interest in the trade agreement, viewing it as a potential catalyst for increased economic cooperation in the region. The first vehicles began arriving at precisely 9 o'clock. A sleek black Mercedes bearing diplomatic plates pulled up to the embassy steps. The Polish representative, Minister Andrzej Kowalski, emerged with his small entourage. Marcus executed a perfect salute, his right hand crisp and steady at the brim of his bearskin hat. The minister nodded appreciatively and proceeded into the building. This pattern continued for the next hour as various officials arrived. Each received the same respectful acknowledgement from Marcus, who stood motionless between arrivals like a statue carved from marble. His training had taught him to remain alert while appearing completely at ease, his eyes constantly scanning the environment for any signs of trouble while maintaining the stoic expression expected of a Queen's Guard. The Hungarian delegation arrived in a convoy of 3 vehicles, their flags fluttering in the gentle morning breeze. Deputy Minister Elena Vargas stepped out of the lead car, resplendent in a navy blue suit adorned with her country's military decorations. Marcus offered the customary salute, which she returned with a warm smile and a few words in accented English about the beauty of his uniform. As the morning progressed, Marcus became increasingly aware of a subtle shift in the atmosphere. Embassy security personnel seemed more tense than usual, their radio communications more frequent. Through his peripheral vision, he noticed additional plainclothes officers positioning themselves at various points around the building. Ambassador Pemberton himself appeared briefly at an upper-floor window, surveying the scene below with what appeared to be concern. The source of this tension became apparent when a military vehicle approached the embassy gates. Unlike the elegant diplomatic cars that had been arriving all morning, this was an armored personnel carrier bearing the insignia of a country that had recently experienced strained relations with several NATO members. The vehicle's presence seemed to cast a shadow over the otherwise ceremonial atmosphere. Colonel Viktor Kozlov emerged from the vehicle with theatrical flair, his uniform a stark contrast to the subdued elegance of the other arriving dignitaries. Kozlov was a man in his 50s, built like a boxer, with steel-gray hair cropped short in military fashion. His chest displayed an impressive array of medals and ribbons, though several embassy staff members would later quietly question the authenticity of some decorations. What struck Marcus immediately was Kozlov's demeanor. Where other officials had approached the embassy with diplomatic restraint, Kozlov strutted forward with an air of superiority that seemed designed to intimidate. His eyes swept the scene with calculated assessment, taking in every detail of the security arrangements and the ceremonial protocols. As Kozlov approached the embassy steps, Marcus prepared to offer the same respectful salute he had given to all previous arrivals. This was standard protocol, a gesture of diplomatic courtesy that transcended political differences. However, as he began to raise his hand, Kozlov suddenly stopped and fixed him with a piercing stare. "You there, British soldier," Kozlov called out in heavily accented English, his voice carrying across the courtyard. "I am Colonel Viktor Kozlov, military attaché and representative of my nation's armed forces. You will provide me with a full military salute, as befits my rank and the dignity of my country." Marcus completed his standard salute, the same gesture he had offered to every other dignitary. But instead of proceeding into the building, Kozlov remained stationary, his expression growing increasingly stern. "That is insufficient," Kozlov declared, his voice rising in volume. "I demand a proper salute, one that acknowledges my superior rank and the sovereignty of my nation. Your casual gesture is an insult to my uniform and my service." The courtyard fell silent. Nearby journalists sensed drama unfolding and began positioning their cameras for better angles. Embassy staff members appeared at windows and doorways, drawn by the unusual commotion. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, but his training held firm. He maintained his composure, his expression remaining neutral despite the awkward situation developing before him. Ambassador Pemberton had been alerted to the confrontation and now appeared at the embassy's main entrance, flanked by his senior staff. His years of diplomatic experience had taught him to recognize potentially explosive situations, and this certainly qualified. The trade agreement that had brought all these dignitaries together was too important to be derailed by a protocol dispute. "Colonel Kozlov," the ambassador called out diplomatically, "welcome to our embassy. Staff Sergeant Wellington has provided you with the appropriate ceremonial acknowledgement, as he has for all our distinguished guests this morning." But Kozlov was not to be placated. He stepped closer to Marcus, his eyes blazing with what appeared to be genuine indignation. "I am not some minor functionary to be dismissed with a perfunctory gesture. I represent a proud military tradition, and I will not be treated with such disrespect on international soil." The tension in the courtyard was palpable. Security personnel moved subtly into position, unsure whether this was simply an overzealous officer making a scene or something more serious. The other diplomats who had gathered to observe the proceedings exchanged concerned glances, recognizing that this confrontation could easily escalate beyond anyone's control. Marcus found himself at the center of an international incident he had neither sought nor desired. His instructions had been clear: maintain dignity, follow protocol, and represent the crown with honor. But those instructions had not prepared him for a situation where following standard protocol would apparently be interpreted as a diplomatic slight. The colonel's demands grew more specific and more unreasonable with each passing moment. He wanted Marcus to present arms, to call out a formal recognition of his rank, to perform what amounted to a subordinate's acknowledgement of a superior officer. These demands went far beyond diplomatic courtesy and ventured into territory that could be interpreted as a symbolic submission of British authority to a foreign military commander. As the standoff continued, Marcus was acutely aware that his response would be scrutinized not just by those present, but by military and diplomatic officials in both countries. The wrong move could create an international incident, damage carefully negotiated relationships, and potentially harm the career of every British official present. Yet there was something in Colonel Kozlov's demeanor that suggested this confrontation was not spontaneous. The way he had positioned himself for maximum visibility, the calculated nature of his demands, the theatrical timing of his arrival, all suggested this was a planned provocation designed to achieve some larger purpose. The morning sun climbed higher in the Prague sky as the two men faced each other on the embassy steps, neither willing to back down. What had begun as a routine ceremonial day was rapidly transforming into a test of wills that would have consequences far beyond anyone's imagination. The standoff on the embassy steps had drawn the attention of everyone within 100 meters. Colonel Kozlov stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his chest thrust forward in a posture that seemed designed to emphasize every medal and ribbon adorning his uniform. His eyes never wavered from Marcus, who maintained the stoic composure that had been drilled into him through years of training. "I am waiting, British soldier," Kozlov announced, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Perhaps your training is insufficient for recognizing the rank of a superior officer. Or perhaps your country no longer teaches proper respect for Allied military personnel." Marcus felt a flush of anger at the slight against his training and his country, but his discipline held firm. He had faced far more intimidating challenges during his service, from hostile crowds outside Buckingham Palace to actual combat situations during his deployment in Afghanistan. This colonel, regardless of his bluster, posed no real threat beyond diplomatic embarrassment. Ambassador Pemberton descended the embassy steps, his diplomatic smile firmly in place despite the obvious tension. "Colonel Kozlov, I'm certain there's been a misunderstanding. Staff Sergeant Wellington is one of our finest soldiers, and he has shown appropriate respect to all our guests today. Perhaps we might move this discussion inside where we can address any concerns in a more suitable environment." But Kozlov waved dismissively at the ambassador's words. "This is not a matter for closed-door diplomacy. This is about respect, about recognition of rank and authority. Your guard has insulted not just me personally, but the military traditions of my entire nation." The colonel's voice grew louder with each sentence, and Marcus began to suspect this performance was intended for the gathering crowd as much as for the embassy staff. Several journalists had moved closer, their cameras capturing every moment of the unfolding drama. News crews from local television stations were arriving, apparently alerted by sources within their respective organizations. Furthermore, Kozlov continued, his accent growing thicker as his agitation increased, "I have specific knowledge of proper military protocol. I have served with distinction for over 30 years, rising through the ranks on merit and dedication. I will not be dismissed by some ceremonial guard who spends his days standing motionless for tourists." The insult to Marcus's service was a calculated provocation, and several embassy staff members visibly bristled at the colonel's words. Marcus himself felt his jaw tighten slightly, but his training in emotional control prevented any visible reaction. He had learned long ago that allowing others to manipulate his emotions was a sign of weakness, not strength. Elizabeth Morrison, the chief of staff, appeared at Ambassador Pemberton's shoulder and whispered urgently in his ear. Marcus caught fragments of her words: media attention, protocol office, and immediate consultation. It was clear that what had begun as a minor diplomatic irritant was rapidly evolving into something that could have lasting consequences. The crowd of onlookers continued to grow. Prague residents, initially drawn by curiosity about the diplomatic event, now sensed they were witnessing something far more dramatic. Several people had begun filming with their mobile phones, and Marcus realized that whatever happened next would likely be broadcast across social media within minutes. Colonel Kozlov seemed to feed off the attention. He began pacing in front of Marcus, his movements sharp and military precise, but with an edge of theatricality that suggested he was performing for an audience rather than simply expressing genuine indignation. "In my country," Kozlov declared, "when a junior officer encounters a senior officer, there are specific protocols that must be followed. These are not suggestions or courtesies. They are requirements that demonstrate respect for rank, experience, and national sovereignty. Your guard's behavior suggests either ignorance of these protocols or deliberate disrespect." Ambassador Pemberton attempted once again to defuse the situation. "Colonel, I assure you that no disrespect was intended. Our ceremonial protocols are designed to show appropriate courtesy to all guests while maintaining the dignity of our embassy and our nation. Perhaps if you could explain specifically what gesture you would consider appropriate, we might find a mutually acceptable solution." For a moment, Marcus thought the ambassador's diplomatic skills might succeed in resolving the crisis. Kozlov paused in his pacing and appeared to consider the proposal. But then, his expression hardened again, and Marcus realized the colonel had no intention of accepting any compromise that didn't result in complete submission to his demands. "The solution is simple," Kozlov announced. "Your guard will present arms in full military fashion, acknowledge my rank verbally and clearly, and demonstrate the proper respect due to a senior officer. This is not negotiable. These are the minimum requirements for diplomatic courtesy as understood by civilized military organizations. The demands were becoming increasingly unreasonable, and Marcus could see the calculation behind them. Colonel Kozlov was not simply seeking respect or recognition. He was attempting to force a public demonstration of British military deference to foreign authority. Such a gesture would be photographed, recorded, and undoubtedly used for propaganda purposes in his home country. Marcus's mind raced through the possible responses. He could comply with Kozlov's demands, ending the confrontation but potentially setting a precedent for future diplomatic bullying. He could maintain his current position, risking an escalation that might damage important international relationships. Or he could find some third option that satisfied diplomatic requirements while maintaining his dignity and that of his uniform. The weight of tradition pressed heavily on his shoulders. The uniform he wore had been worn by thousands of soldiers before him, men who had faced far greater challenges with courage and integrity. The red tunic, the gleaming buttons, the bearskin hat. These were not mere costume pieces, but symbols of a military heritage that stretched back centuries. As Marcus considered his options, he became aware of movement in the crowd. Several individuals were pushing through the gathered onlookers, their purposeful movements and coordinated approach suggesting they were not casual observers. Embassy security had noticed them too, and Marcus could see guards discreetly repositioning themselves. One of the approaching figures was a tall, distinguished man in his 60s wearing the unmistakable bearing of a career military officer. As he drew closer, Marcus could see the subtle insignia that identified him as a senior NATO liaison officer stationed in Prague. His presence added another layer of complexity to an already delicate situation. Colonel Kozlov noticed the new arrival, and his expression shifted slightly, suggesting recognition and perhaps concern. The NATO officer approached the group with calm authority, his movements deliberate but non-threatening. "Good morning, Colonel Kozlov," the NATO officer said in clear, unaccented English. "I am Brigadier General James Patterson, NATO liaison for Central European operations." I couldn't help but notice the discussion taking place here. Kozlov's response was immediate and defensive. "General Patterson, this is a matter between myself and the British Embassy. I am simply requesting appropriate military courtesy from their ceremonial guard." Patterson nodded thoughtfully, his experienced eyes taking in the entire scene, the gathered crowd, the news cameras, the tense embassy staff, and the motionless figure of Marcus in his ceremonial uniform. "I see. And what specific courtesy are you requesting?" "Full military honors appropriate to my rank," Kozlov replied, his voice slightly less confident than it had been moments before. "Present arms, verbal acknowledgement, proper protocol as understood by professional military organizations." General Patterson's expression remained neutral, but Marcus detected a subtle shift in his demeanor that suggested the NATO officer was not impressed by Kozlov's demands. "I see. And you believe such honors are required by international diplomatic protocol?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kozlov's chest puffed out again, but his response came a fraction of a second too late, suggesting uncertainty beneath his bluster. Of course, any professional military man would understand the importance of proper respect between Allied officers. "Allied officers," Patterson repeated slowly, his tone suggesting careful consideration of the phrase. "That's an interesting choice of words, Colonel. I'm curious about your understanding of the current status of various international military relationships." Marcus could see that General Patterson was maneuvering the conversation toward territory that made Colonel Kozlov distinctly uncomfortable. The colonel's eyes darted briefly toward the news cameras, perhaps realizing that his public confrontation was attracting exactly the kind of scrutiny he might prefer to avoid. The morning sun continued its climb, casting sharp shadows across the embassy courtyard. The gathered crowd had swelled to nearly 100 people, and Marcus could see additional security personnel taking positions around the perimeter. What had begun as a routine ceremonial duty was rapidly becoming an international incident with implications far beyond anyone's initial expectations. In the distance, the bells of Prague's ancient churches began their hourly chimes, marking the passage of time and emphasizing how long this confrontation had continued. Marcus remained at attention, his training allowing him to maintain perfect posture despite the stress of the situation. But, beneath his calm exterior, he was preparing himself for whatever would come next, knowing that his response to Colonel Kozlov's demands would be remembered and analyzed for years to come. General Patterson's presence had subtly but decisively shifted the dynamic of the confrontation. While Colonel Kozlov maintained his aggressive posture, Marcus could detect uncertainty creeping into the man's demeanor. The NATO liaison officer possessed the quiet authority that came from decades of genuine military leadership, and his questions had exposed potential weaknesses in Kozlov's position. Colonel, Patterson continued, his voice carrying the weight of professional experience. I'm quite familiar with international military protocols, having spent the better part of my career working with Allied forces across multiple theaters. I'm curious which specific regulation or treaty provision you believe mandates the honors you're requesting. Kozlov's response came too quickly, suggesting rehearsal rather than genuine knowledge. Article 7 of the International Military Courtesy Protocol, as established by the Warsaw Convention of 1987. Patterson's eyebrows rose slightly, and Marcus caught the hint of a smile at the corners of the general's mouth. Several embassy staff members exchanged glances, and Ambassador Pemberton stepped forward with renewed confidence. I'm afraid there's been some confusion, Colonel, Patterson said gently. There was no Warsaw Convention in 1987, and no such protocol exists in current international law. Military courtesy between allied nations is governed by mutual respect and diplomatic convention, not by mandatory honor guards or enforced salutes. The color drained from Kozlov's face as he realized his fabrication had been exposed before an international audience. News cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of his growing discomfort. The crowd of onlookers sensed the shift in momentum, and several people began murmuring among themselves. But, rather than backing down, Kozlov doubled down on his demands with increasing desperation. Regardless of specific documentation, basic military courtesy demands proper recognition of rank. This British Guard has shown insufficient respect, and I will not be dismissed like some minor functionary. Marcus watched the colonel's performance with professional interest. His training in crowd psychology and threat assessment suggested that Kozlov was now operating from a position of wounded pride rather than calculated strategy. This made him potentially more dangerous, as desperate people often made poor decisions. General Patterson nodded thoughtfully, as if considering Kozlov's words seriously. I understand your concern about respect, Colonel. Military honor is indeed important. However, I should point out that Staff Sergeant Wellington has shown appropriate courtesy to all guests this morning, including yourself. The salute he offered is standard diplomatic protocol for ceremonial guards. Furthermore, Patterson continued, his voice gaining authority. Demanding specific military honors from foreign personnel on embassy grounds could be interpreted as an attempt to assert territorial authority over sovereign territory. I'm sure that wasn't your intention, but such actions might be viewed as diplomatically provocative. The implication was clear, and Kozlov's bluster began to crumble visibly. Several of his own accompanying officers, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, now exchanged concerned looks. They appeared to recognize that their colonel had overplayed his hand dramatically. Ambassador Pemberton seized the opportunity to regain control of the situation. Gentlemen, I believe we've all devoted enough attention to this matter of protocol. Colonel Kozlov, you are welcome to join us inside for the ceremony, where I'm certain we can address any remaining concerns through appropriate diplomatic channels. But Marcus could see that Kozlov was trapped in a position of his own making. He had made his demands so publicly and so forcefully that backing down would represent a humiliating defeat. Yet continuing to press his case risked exposing him to further professional embarrassment. The colonel's next move surprised everyone present. Instead of accepting the diplomatic exit being offered, he stepped directly in front of Marcus and raised his voice to address the entire gathering. I call upon everyone present to witness this insult to military honor, Kozlov announced dramatically. This British soldier's refusal to show proper respect demonstrates his country's arrogance and disregard for international military tradition. I demand that appropriate measures be taken to address this slight against my nation's dignity. The theatrical nature of his declaration drew uncomfortable silence from the crowd. Even the journalists seemed taken aback by the colonel's over-the-top performance. Marcus remained motionless, but he could sense the collective embarrassment of the spectators who were witnessing what appeared to be a senior military officer having a public meltdown. General Patterson's expression hardened slightly, and when he spoke, his voice carried unmistakable authority. "Colonel Kozlov, I believe you may be experiencing some confusion about the nature of this event and the appropriate protocols involved. Perhaps it would be beneficial for you to consult with your superiors before making any further public statements." The suggestion that Kozlov needed guidance from his superiors was a diplomatic way of questioning his competence and authority. Several people in the crowd recognized the subtle rebuke, and Marcus could see Kozlov's face reddening with anger and embarrassment. "I need no guidance in matters of military honor," Kozlov snapped, his accent becoming thicker as his agitation increased. "I have served my nation with distinction for over 3 decades, and I will not be lectured by NATO officials about proper protocol." Patterson's response was measured and professional, but Marcus detected steel beneath the diplomatic courtesy. "Your service record is not in question, Colonel. However, your understanding of current international diplomatic protocol appears to be somewhat outdated. Military courtesy is based on mutual respect, not enforced submission." The exchange had attracted the attention of additional embassy personnel, and Marcus noticed several senior diplomats gathering at windows overlooking the courtyard. He realized that this confrontation was being closely monitored by officials who would undoubtedly report the incident to their respective governments. As the tension continued to build, Marcus made a decision that would surprise everyone present, including himself. Drawing upon his years of training in conflict de-escalation and his deep understanding of military psychology, he chose to break his ceremonial silence. "Colonel Kozlov," Marcus said, his voice clear and respectful but carrying unmistakable authority, "I have served as a Queen's Guard for 12 years, during which time I have had the honor of providing ceremonial duties for heads of state, royalty, and distinguished military officers from nations around the world. The salute I offered you this morning was the same mark of respect I have given to generals, admirals, prime ministers, and kings." The crowd fell completely silent, stunned by the guard's unexpected decision to speak. Colonel Kozlov himself appeared momentarily speechless, perhaps not having expected direct engagement from someone he had dismissed as a mere ceremonial figure. Marcus continued, his tone remaining respectful but firm. "Military honor is not demonstrated through demands for special treatment or public confrontations. It is shown through service, discipline, and respect for the traditions and sovereignty of other nations. The uniform I wear represents centuries of military tradition, and I will not allow it to be diminished by participating in a display that serves no purpose other than personal aggrandizement." The words struck the assembly like a thunderbolt. Here was a soldier who had maintained perfect discipline under pressure, who had refused to be provoked despite increasingly unreasonable demands, and who had chosen his moment to speak with devastating effectiveness. Colonel Kozlov's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. He appeared to be struggling with the realization that his target had not only refused to be intimidated but had turned the confrontation against him with quiet dignity and unassailable logic. General Patterson stepped forward, his expression showing clear approval of Marcus's response. "Well said, Staff Sergeant. That is precisely the kind of military bearing that brings honor to any uniform." Ambassador Pemberton seized the moment to bring the confrontation to a close. "I believe Staff Sergeant Wellington has addressed any questions about proper military courtesy. Colonel Kozlov, the ceremony inside awaits your participation, should you choose to join us." The invitation was polite, but carried an unmistakable undertone. The show was over, and it was time to move on. Kozlov found himself facing a crowd that had witnessed his public humiliation, news cameras that had recorded his unreasonable demands, and military officers who had seen through his bluster to expose his fundamental lack of professionalism. For several long moments, Colonel Kozlov stood frozen, apparently unable to process how completely his planned provocation had backfired. The confident, aggressive officer who had arrived demanding special treatment now appeared deflated and uncertain, his earlier bravado replaced by the dawning realization that he had made a serious error in judgment. The courtyard remained suspended in absolute silence as Colonel Kozlov struggled to process the complete reversal of his carefully planned confrontation. What he had intended as a demonstration of his authority and his nation's importance had transformed into a public exhibition of his own professional inadequacy. The news cameras continued recording, ensuring that his humiliation would be preserved and disseminated far beyond the embassy grounds. Marcus maintained his position at attention, but those who knew him well could detect a subtle change in his demeanor. Having broken his ceremonial silence to address the situation directly, he had assumed a more active role in the proceedings. His words had been measured and respectful, but they had devastated Kozlov's position more effectively than any diplomatic protest. General Patterson stepped closer to the colonel, his expression showing a mixture of professional disappointment and paternal concern. "Colonel Kozlov, I believe this situation has gone far enough. Your delegation is welcome to participate in today's ceremony, but I strongly suggest we move past this unfortunate misunderstanding." But Colonel Kozlov was not prepared to concede defeat, even in the face of overwhelming evidence that his position was untenable. His pride, and perhaps his political survival back home, depended on salvaging something from this disaster. With the desperate energy of a cornered animal, he made one final, shocking move. Reaching into his uniform jacket, Kozlov withdrew a folded document that he brandished toward the assembled crowd. "This," he announced in a voice that cracked slightly with emotion, "is an official diplomatic protest that I am prepared to file with the International Court of Justice in The Hague. This British soldier's insubordination and his government's refusal to address the matter appropriately constitute a violation of international law." The threat drew gasps from several onlookers and prompted immediate movement from embassy security personnel. Ambassador Pemberton's expression darkened as he realized that Kozlov was threatening to escalate a minor protocol dispute into a formal international legal matter. "Colonel," the ambassador said firmly, "I believe you may be overreacting to what was clearly a misunderstanding about ceremonial protocol. Filing frivolous complaints with international courts would not reflect well on your nation's reputation for diplomatic reasonableness." General Patterson's response was even more direct. "Colonel Kozlov, as a NATO liaison officer with considerable experience in international legal matters, I feel obligated to inform you that threatening to file false or exaggerated complaints with international courts could itself be considered a violation of diplomatic protocol. I strongly advise you to reconsider this course of action." But Kozlov had passed the point of rational decision-making. His voice rose to near shouting levels as he continued his tirade. "This is not a threat, it is a promise. My government will not tolerate such disrespect, and the world will see how British arrogance undermines international cooperation." As he spoke, Kozlov waved the document dramatically, apparently for the benefit of the news cameras. However, his theatrical gestures proved to be his final undoing. A gust of wind caught the paper, tearing it from his grasp and sending it tumbling across the courtyard. Marcus, responding with the quick reflexes that had served him well in military situations, stepped forward and caught the document before it could blow into the street. As he handed it back to the colonel, his eyes briefly scanned the paper's contents, and what he saw there caused his expression to change subtly. "Colonel," Marcus said quietly, "I believe you may want to review this document before presenting it officially." Confused by the guard's statement, Kozlov snatched the paper back and glanced at it himself. The color drained from his face as he realized his error. In his haste and agitation, he had grabbed the wrong document from his jacket. Instead of a diplomatic protest, he was holding what appeared to be a personal letter written in his native language. General Patterson, noting the colonel's sudden pallor, stepped closer. "Is there a problem with your documentation, Colonel?" Kozlov attempted to fold the paper quickly and return it to his jacket, but his hands were shaking noticeably. Several people in the crowd had noticed his distress, and the news cameras captured every moment of his growing panic. "No problem," Kozlov stammered, his English suddenly much less fluent than it had been throughout the confrontation. "Simple mistake. Wrong paper." But Ambassador Pemberton had spent too many years in diplomatic service to miss the significance of Kozlov's behavior. "Colonel, if you're experiencing difficulties with your documentation, Perhaps we should postpone any formal proceedings until you've had an opportunity to organize your materials properly. The suggestion was polite, but carried an unmistakable subtext. Kozlov's competence was being questioned publicly, and his continued presence was becoming an embarrassment to everyone involved. At that moment, one of Kozlov's accompanying officers stepped forward and spoke quietly but urgently in their native language. Marcus couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly one of alarm and advice. The officer appeared to be urging his superior to end the confrontation immediately. Kozlov's response was sharp and defensive, but his voice lacked the authority he had projected earlier. The exchange continued for several moments, drawing uncomfortable attention from the gathering crowd. It became clear to everyone present that Kozlov's own staff was advising him to abandon his position. General Patterson seized the opportunity to bring the situation to a definitive close. "Colonel Kozlov, I believe your officers are providing sound advice. This has been an unfortunate misunderstanding that has gone on far too long. I suggest we all move forward in the spirit of international cooperation that brought us here today." The NATO officer's words carried the weight of both military authority and diplomatic wisdom. Even Kozlov seemed to recognize that he had reached the end of his options. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time since his arrival, he appeared uncertain about his next move. Marcus returned to his position at attention, but his brief intervention had fundamentally changed the dynamic of the entire situation. He had demonstrated that true military bearing was not about demanding respect, but about earning it through professionalism, dignity, and principled action. The crowd of onlookers began to disperse, sensing that the drama had reached its conclusion. News crews packed their equipment, having captured more than enough footage to tell the story of a diplomatic confrontation that had ended in spectacular failure for its instigator. Colonel Kozlov stood alone for a moment, abandoned by his entourage and ignored by the departing crowd. His grand gesture had collapsed into humiliation, his threats had been exposed as empty bluster, and his attempt to assert dominance had resulted in complete defeat. Finally, without another word, Kozlov turned and walked back toward his military vehicle. His movements were stiff and awkward, lacking the confident swagger he had displayed upon arrival. His officers followed at a respectful distance, their expressions suggesting they understood the career implications of their superior's public failure. As the colonel's vehicle departed the embassy grounds, Ambassador Pemberton approached Marcus with a mixture of relief and admiration. "Well done, Staff Sergeant. That was exactly the kind of response that brings honor to the uniform." General Patterson joined them, extending his hand to Marcus in a gesture of professional respect. "Outstanding bearing under pressure, Sergeant. You handled that situation better than many officers with twice your rank." Marcus accepted the compliments with quiet professionalism, but his focus was already returning to his ceremonial duties. The other diplomatic delegations would be arriving for the trade ceremony, and he was determined that the rest of the day would proceed with the dignity and respect that such occasions deserved. In the days that followed, news of the confrontation spread rapidly through diplomatic and military circles. Colonel Kozlov's behavior was widely criticized by his own government, leading to his quiet reassignment to a desk job far from international affairs. His attempt to create a diplomatic incident had instead become a case study in how not to conduct oneself in international settings. Marcus, meanwhile, received commendations from both his military superiors and diplomatic officials. His response to an impossible situation had demonstrated the values that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent: dignity, professionalism, and unshakable integrity. The trade ceremony proceeded without further incident, and the agreements signed that day would go on to strengthen economic cooperation across Eastern Europe. But those who were present would long remember the morning when a foreign officer's unreasonable demands met their match in the quiet dignity of a British soldier who understood that true honor comes not from demanding respect, but from earning it through exemplary conduct. The story became legend within diplomatic circles, a reminder that genuine military bearing and professional excellence cannot be intimidated, threatened, or bullied into submission. And, in the end, it was not Colonel Kozlov's rank or his loud demands that were remembered, but Marcus Wellington's quiet demonstration that respect is earned through character, not commanded through bluster.